Welcome. My name is Penny Rosema, and you're listening to the Cookware Manufacturers Association podcast. One of our goals is to keep our members informed, and in this podcast, our guest expert is Tonya Kemp. Now, Tonya has worked in Washington, D.C. for more than 25 years. She's worked with U.S. government officials and members of Congress on various issues, ranging from free trade agreements to regulatory policy. After working for both trade associations and the private sector, Tonya is now branching out on her own to use her broad experience to help provide insight and strategic guidance to companies needing help in understanding that developing global regulatory environment that has such an impact on all categories of the consumer goods. Now, you can find more information about Tonya in our show notes for this episode, or you can always reach out to me for information and her contact. And of course, you can find more information about CMA at cookware.org. Little background, Tonya and I met while we were both served on the International Trade Advisory Committee, that's a mouthful, in Washington, D.C. I reached out to her at that time for support on acronyms and all kinds of different things I was trying to get my head around while we were sitting on those committee meetings. But I reached out to her recently for support as I tried to understand the European regulatory process. And as many of our listeners probably already know, there's a pinball effect. What happens in Europe ends up impacting regulatory decisions and processes and what people are looking at in the US. So we're looking forward to talking to Tonya today to get a better background and understanding of how this regulatory environment works. Hello, Tonya. Welcome to our podcast. It's been a while since I met you in DC with our ITAC meetings. They've all gone virtual now. But again, as I stated earlier, I was so glad to meet you and how helpful you were with me getting updated on those acronyms. In fact, I looked at my list today. I have a running list of 87 acronyms when I'm on those calls that I have to reference. So how have you been? The weather's good over there?
Hi, Penny. Yes. Thanks for having me. And yes, the weather actually today is going to be a very nice day with a high of 85 and low humidity. So it's actually very rare for summer in Washington to be this nice. It's going to get hot and muggy later on in the week.
Yeah, you guys are used to muggy weather, aren't you?
Yes. So
I reached out to you recently on this, potential influence of the EU regulations. And we were talking specifically on PFAS, that nonstick coatings and what's happening with the cookware, bakeware. There's a call for evidence by REACH and ECHA, and we collaborated with some of our European counterparts. But what we want to talk about today is for anyone who's not real familiar with this regulatory world, their eyes are probably glassing over when we start talking about ECHA and REACH. I wanted to start with this question. Can you describe what ECHA is and what the acronym stands for? And is there anything similar for people to relate to from the U.S. standpoint?
Okay, so ECHA, or ECHA is what I usually call it, and a lot of Americans call it ECHA because it's ECHA, is the European Chemicals Agency. So it has the job of regulating chemicals and biocides that are placed on the EU market. In the United States, we don't have something directly equivalent, but I would say it's most similar to the EPA. But its main function is limited to the assessment of chemicals. So yes, I think this is why, as you said, the call for notice, it's very important to have experts, and that's where trade associations play a role, is that they can gather the company information to get that expertise and the scientific information to provide the regulators as they're making up these rules and assessing these chemicals.
And I noticed that in our pre-conversation, some notes that you sent me, that you gave a link that I'll put in the show notes that is hot topics that were related to PFAS chemicals and what's going on with that. So I'll remind listeners to check the show notes because they'll be able to see that link in there. All right, now is REACH the right way to say the second acronym I'm talking about? And what does that stand for and what is similar in the US?
Okay, so I think a lot of people have heard of REACH, or I hope they have. It's the chemical legislation for the European Union. It stands for Registration, Evaluation, Authorization, and Restriction of Chemicals. It entered into force on June 1st, 2007. And I'd say in the US, the most closest thing we have would be TSCA. or the new LOSCA, right? The Toxic Substances Control Act, which is regulated by the EPA.
All right. Again, listeners, all of this information we're going to have in printed form online because you're going to go back to it and want to reference it if you're not familiar with these acronyms and these organizations. But Tonya, the next question leads to why should U.S. industry cookware and bakeware companies pay attention to ECHA, and REACH and what they're working on? How have you seen it play out globally in other examples? Can you help us understand what's important about it?
So the European Union considers itself a leader around the globe. It tries to explain its system and educate people on its system, and then encourage other countries to adopt a similar system or relate theirs to the European way. So once REACH passed, you've seen this education and outreach going around, and now you have a REACH legislation in Korea, you have a REACH in China, and you see new chemical legislations being enacted in California, New York, and other states in the United States. And it's all because there's a new focus on the individual chemicals being used in products and a lot of fear about these chemicals and what they do to us. So as they evaluate these, you just see it going around the world, and each one has a basis behind what the EU has done. But then the most concerning part is when they make little tweaks on their own. And that's a lot of data for each country to provide. Another example would be Brazil is currently looking at creating a chemical legislation. And at one point they were looking at REACH. They seem to have backed down from that, and now we're looking at the Canadian hot list, which your members are probably more familiar with. The Canadian hot list, which is seen as a win by the American Chemistry Council, that at least the hot list seems less problematic than REACH because of all the data and information. The other issue with a lot of these country legislations and REACH is that you have to notify the ingredients in your product to each one, and then they have to, most of them, be done in the native language. So it means that you need people that actually speak Portuguese, speak Korean, speak Chinese, are able to write it, use the system, and upload your documentation, the safety data sheets and other things into their system so they can evaluate your products.
Mind blowing. I can feel people's eyes glassing over again. So a lot of great information in there. And I just want to remind that Tonya is sharing her insight and experience with us with respect to the US and the EU proposed regulations. And you can find more information about Tonya on her LinkedIn profile, and her name is spelled TonyaKemp. Of course, if you have any trouble reaching out to her, you can look at our show notes, you can give me a call or an email, and my information is available on our website at cookware.org. And of course, there's a wealth of information from our association about these topics. One in particular, another topic in this area of legislation is a U.S. regulation, HR 6395. So, and as I understand this status, I haven't checked it this week, but the House of Representatives back in July passed passed the bill, and there was a provision in that bill which set military spending for fiscal 2021, and that would require Defense Department to cease purchasing certain products containing PFAS. And that included in that is a military procurement policy that would cover cookware, personal care products like dental floss and sunscreen, carpeting, and upholstery. Of course, the one we care about is cookware. I don't know how many members are familiar with that, but we do share that information to all of our members via email to their core representative. And if someone is a member listening and is not getting that information, again, reach out to me and I can make sure you're on that hot list to be informed. But, you know, there's some other provisions in that bill, but the Senate version of it, which they call S4049, they must name all of these different versions. Maybe Tonya can help me understand that, does not contain the two provisions, the two PFAS provisions that we're talking about. And so these are items that we need to watch in the coming weeks. Now, I want to remind listeners, Tonya, that we as an association, I know some large associations actually have a lobbying arm of them. We're a small association, a staff of one, and so we don't dive into lobbying related activities, but we are working very hard about keeping people informed, connecting the dots, and sharing information. And we have done position papers, for example, that call for evidence with the EU REACH, PFAS. We collaborated with some others on that. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But what I'd like to ask you, Tonya, is what can you recommend to our members that they can do on their own? Any words of advice?
Yeah, let's go back because you had a earlier question in those comments about the difference between the Senate version and the House. As you say, these are spending bills, which are the appropriations bills. And as you put in the appropriations bills, each side, the Senate and the House, will create their own bills of what they need to spend or what their spending plans are for the year. And then once the House passes it, they'll send their version to the Senate. The Senate will pass theirs, send it to the House. Now, basically, a lot of times they'll have two separate bills, and then they'll come together and negotiate and turn it into one bill. And so they'll make amendments in the Senate on the House bill to make it more similar to the Senate version or vice versa. And then they'll finalize the bill and it'll go through. I would say, that they are on recess now for August. So there probably won't be much activity on the Senate side. I know the House is coming back for other reasons, and they won't be taking up new bills, and this has already passed the House. But right now the Senate is on recess. And we're going into election period, which may or may not cause them to act faster on appropriations bills, because that always happens at the end of the year, or they'll just do a bill to complete, until the end of the year. A supplemental bill. So what can you do on your own? Well, even though the association doesn't lobby per se, the members, they do have their local congressmen and women that they can reach out to and talk to as a voter and tell them their positions. So any type of proactive consumer education is helpful. So right now they're hearing one side. They're hearing from the Environmental Working Group and other NGOs expressing concern about the safety of certain chemicals. These then causes consumers, which are voters, to react and call their legislatures. Sometimes these groups will create a letter and it'll be mass signing of different people going along the web, and it'll become a petition to stop things. And so this type of information can be either helpful or harmful. In this situation, it goes against PFAS, right? So when you're working with EPA and ECHA, a lot of the solid science and the things that companies have are very important to do that. And most of their decisions are supposed to be made on sound science. And then proprietary information, I know companies don't like to give that. So that's why they work with their trade associations to create general data that's not specific to a company and that people can present as an industry, giving it one voice. And so this is the time for companies to work together on messaging and to also work with their trade association as well as with their own politicians locally to talk about the issue and their concerns for their companies and their employees and the impact this could have on them.
Thank you, Tonya. That's great information. Kind of what I heard, I'm going to recap and correct me if I got it wrong. As far as the appropriation bills and the spending process, it starts in either the House or the Senate, and then it goes back and forth until they negotiate through to a final bill. It can be impacted by the election. Someone might want to try and push it through, or it could just be delayed because of the election. So that could have either effect as we go through this fall. And then for steps, we heard number one, your action as a voter. If you have an opinion on it and you have science and information you're comfortable with, they can reach out to their own elected officials, right? But as an association, which we've done a great job, I think we have an excellent engineering subcommittee who's very engaged and works hard to keep me informed. And we're also working in collaboration with the FEC, which anybody that's not familiar with that is the Federation of European Manufacturers of Cookware and Cutlery. and to talk about how we collaborated together with non-confidential information, but science-based data, created a position paper on that PFAS, and for that call for action in Europe, we actually submitted a position paper on it. We're also working in collaboration with the FEC on a FAQ list, some key data, actual information about nonstick cookware and what the, how it's related, or I should say not related to PFAS. It's a big umbrella. Someone once referred to this PFAS issue as like the cholesterol. We used to say all cholesterol was bad, right? Well, then we found out you need to dive a little bit deeper, because there is cholesterol that's the good cholesterol and there's the bad cholesterol. And make sure you're putting things in the right bucket. And our position paper to the FEC was to try and clarify that, right? We are absolutely not against protecting the environment and consumers, but let's do it on fact-based science with the right information.
And those talking points you mentioned are very important to also give out at the state level if their company has any federal affairs employees, to give them to take to the state level, as well as within their own company to the employees, because the employees are the biggest voice and they're also voters. So to get them involved helps them be proactive in fighting for their jobs and for the impact this could have on a company.
You mentioned something at the state level, you called it the federal affairs. Is there in some states an actual job position that's called federal affairs, but at the state level? I wasn't familiar with that.
Well, I'm using a term that we used, I guess, as a department in one of the trade associations I worked. It was a separate department where they had specific staff. One's dedicated to the state level and one's dedicated to the federal level. And we call that government affairs or federal affairs. Yeah. So, and sometimes companies have those. Sometimes companies have their own lobbyists and their own government affairs department or public affairs department that they can utilize.
That's a good point. And for our association, if I have members in those roles, I should make sure that I'm connected with them, that we're working in collaboration. All right, Tonya, the last question is, how do we stay current on proposed legislation?
I would say that is pretty difficult at times, because there's so much legislation out there that it's hard to keep track. And many times bills get presented that go nowhere. They're first introduced in a committee. They can sit there forever and never be introduced by the chairman of the committee, or they can move forward past the committee, get voted out, have a hearing, get voted out, and then go to the federal or state to get voted on, and then it passes that particular house. So I would say the fastest bills are at the state level. They tend to operate very quickly, especially like California, because it's more of one party. So there's not much opposition to what they do. So when things get introduced, if there's a huge popularity in it or trend, it seems to move really, really fast. So a lot of times it's important to have friends inside the House and Senate that can alert you to these things. This is usually done through larger trade associations like National Association of Manufacturers, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Your individual members in your association may be hearing things, like your companies. They have, as I said, different departments, and they may have their own government affairs people are hearing things and might be able to provide you that information so that you can work as an industry together. And then there's trade periodicals are also extremely helpful. Sometimes the information in different ones can be a little bit late and talk about what just happened, but sometimes the trade specific ones can be really useful and give you an alert that it's coming. And I don't know the specific ones for the Cookware Association right now, but I know, we had something called the Rose Sheet for the cosmetics industry that would outline everything going on in FDA and any bill for the House and Senate. And so that was something that the trade association there really paid attention to and watched the articles there of what was being said outside of that.
A lot of great advice in there. Some of the highlights that I wrote down is that the fastest bills often start at the state level. And we're very familiar with and keep track of what's going on in California. And again, noting that it's a great idea to have resources. One of the resources you mentioned was the National Association of Manufacturers, and CMA, Cookware Manufacturers Association, is a member of NAM, the National Association of Manufacturers. And one great example from that is keeping up with their, what you call maybe their federal affairs kind of department. They're giving us information on something called SIP, S-C-I-P. And that acronym is the latest one that starts for Substance of Concern in Products. That's going on in Europe. Now, Tonya, are you familiar with that one? I hadn't talked to you about this earlier, so sorry to put you on the spot, but there apparently was already this SIP database out there, or it was coming. Do you know which it was? Are you familiar with that one?
No, each industry seems to have its own notification system under ECHA where they focus on each separate industry. So SIP is not as familiar to me as some of the other databases they have.
I'm actually kind of glad that you say that, because I was afraid I was falling behind, and I think this one's kind of gearing up and is coming to a higher level of attention just over the last few months. Now, what we're doing with our fall meeting, we're putting it virtually, it will be on September 26th. And we're going to have a panel of speakers that are joining us from, to talk about all the regulatory pinball stuff that's going on, PFAS, but also on that topic is this SIP, S-C-I-P, and we're trying to pull in some people from Brussels, our USTR connections in Brussels, and do a little bit of pre-recorded conversation with them, or at a minimum, the NAM representatives that are most familiar with what's going on with that database. There's some deadlines, I believe, in January of 2021 that were set up a while ago on this database. And because of COVID, it's impacted a whole bunch of people. So everybody from the automotive industry to the chemicals, or at least I know from what I'm seeing in NAM, are raising awareness on it, saying that it's too tight a timing and it's not well defined, and it's asking for stuff that's beyond IT capabilities haven't all been set up on it. So we'll remind listeners that topic will be covered in our virtual meeting. So the registration for the fall meeting is on our homepage of cookware.org, and they might want to consider signing up for that. It's a $29 for members and $49 for non-members. So a real easy way to sign up, and there will be 3 major events, speakers and conversations that I think they will find very valuable. So Tonya, thank you for sharing your time and your insight and expertise. I just wonder, is there anything else you think we missed that would be important to tell members about what's going on in the regulatory area?
Only that I think you all have seen it. It's that the last few years have really seen a big increase in chemical safety concerns. I'm not sure if it's due to the internet, or just renewed interest by consumers, but we saw the first signs in Europe, in California, and now we're seeing it kind of move on to other states in bigger ways, as well as to the federal level. So as things develop in the states, you can be sure that they're going to move to the federal level at some point, or at least be discussed at the federal level. So it's important to be as alerted as early as possible, and to work with CMA to develop a strategy on how to react. And I would say, I just looked, and SIP is it's under the Waste Framework Directive. And so it's all about the life cycle of products and materials. So it is indeed new and started being discussed in late 2018, but is starting to pick up and include notifications and things starting in 2020. So yeah, it's a new list that they've set up. That's even more fun. As they look at recycling and this zero waste economy, right? That they want everything recycled by 2025. Things like this are starting to pop up in every sector of how to dispose of your articles properly.
Yes, and as you mentioned, the way to keep informed in what's going on with that, if members listening or non-members listening, is there someone in your organization, especially in probably the product development area, and if any trade that you're doing, so if you're selling into the European market, or it's just, you need to stay up on it. And CMA is definitely one of those resources that people would find helpful connecting with. So thank you, Tonya. I appreciate all your insight, and especially your gift of time. Thank you for talking with us. I have a feeling we'll be reaching out to you some more, so let's stay in touch. again, if members want to reach you, they can come, certainly reach through me, but also look at our show notes for your contact information there, and have a great day.
Thank you, Penny.
All right, folks, that makes a wrap up for this episode, and we thank you all for listening, and enjoy the day.